The human captain joked about marrying her someday. Years later, the alien war queen returned. Alarms were screaming through the hull when I first saw her, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The cargo hold reeked of burnt metal and coolant smoke. Sparks fell from a broken conduit above the door. Every crew member near me had a weapon raised, and every weapon was pointed at the same thing: a creature chained to the floor, 9 feet tall, covered in dark-plated skin that shimmered faintly under the emergency lights. Her eyes were the color of fire held behind glass, and she was watching all of us like we were the ones in danger, not her. Her name, we would learn later, was Vera. To her people, she was not a soldier. She was a queen. Not the gentle kind from old stories, but the kind that led fleets into battle and came home with more ships than she left with. We had pulled her out of the wreck of her own dreadnought 2 hours earlier, the only living thing left on a ship that used to carry thousands. Command wanted her alive. I wanted the shaking in my hands to stop. "Get the restraints checked again," I said, and my voice cracked on the second word. Nobody laughed, nobody dared. She turned her head toward me slowly, like she had all the time in the universe and I had none. "You are the one giving orders," she said. Her voice came out low and layered, like 2 voices speaking at once, roughened by a translator box clipped to her collar. Small, for a captain. Big talk, I said, for someone in chains. The room went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Then she laughed. It was a sound like stone grinding against stone, awful and strange, but it was a laugh, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. "My name is Daniel Ashwood, and at the time, I was captain of a supply and escort vessel called the Halcyon, a ship never built for war, dragged into one anyway. We were not supposed to encounter a Cathari war queen. We were supposed to deliver medical supplies to the outer colonies and go home. Instead, we had found the last survivor of a battle that had cost my side 11,000 lives, and now she was sitting in my cargo hold, and command wanted her transferred alive to a research station 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. That is a long time to sit across from something that could tear through steel with its bare hands, and still look bored doing it. The first 2 days, nobody spoke to her, except to give orders. She did not eat. She did not sleep. Or if she did, none of us ever saw it happen. She simply watched, amber eyes following every movement in the hold, like she was memorizing our weaknesses, one by one. On the 3rd day, I brought her food myself. I do not fully know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe some foolish part of me could not stand the idea of anything, even an enemy, starving in the dark corner of my ship. I set the tray down and stepped back before her chains could reach me, though I knew they wouldn't. "You are afraid," she said, not looking at the food. "Cautious," I said. "There's a difference. Your heart is beating fast enough that I can hear it from here." "You have very good ears then." She looked at me for a long moment, before finally reaching for the food. "I am told humans surrender quickly when frightened. You do not act frightened enough to surrender. Maybe I'm just not that smart." That earned another one of those grinding laughs, shorter this time, almost surprised out of her. I left the hold feeling strange, lighter somehow, though I could not explain why at the time. By the end of the first week, I found myself returning every day, sometimes twice. I told myself it was intelligence gathering, that command would want notes on her behavior, her species, her habits. That excuse got thinner every day. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I wanted to talk to her. She told me about her home world, a place with 3 moons, and skies the color of rust at dawn. She told me about her mothers, 4 of them, all queens before her, all killed in different wars across different decades. She told me about a species she called the Silent Ones, an enemy so terrible that her people had once burned their own colonies, rather than let them fall into silent hands. I told her about Earth, about rivers and rain, and the way snow looked falling under streetlights. I told her humans keep predators as pets, which she found genuinely disturbing, and I could not stop laughing at her horrified expression when I explained what a house cat was. "You allow small killers to live inside your homes," she said, mandibles clicking in something between disbelief and disgust. "Your species makes no sense to me." "You're chained to the floor of my ship, eating my rations and asking me questions about pets," I said. "I don't think you're in a position to call anyone strange." "Fair," she said, and it was the first time I heard her use a human word instead of waiting for her translator, and something about that small thing stuck with me for years afterward. Week 2 brought a problem. 2 of my crew, a young engineer named Oliver Hastings and a security officer named Grace Whitfield, came to me separately with the same concern. I was spending too much time with the prisoner. It was not procedure, it was not safe. Command would not approve. "She's not a person, Captain," Grace said, standing in my quarters with her arms crossed. "She's a weapon. You're talking to her like she's crew." "I'm gathering information," I said, which was not entirely a lie anymore, but was not entirely the truth either. "Then let someone else gather it." I did not have a good answer for that, so I gave her the only one that felt honest. "I will be careful." Grace did not look convinced, and honestly, neither was I, but I kept going back, because somewhere in those long transit hours, between stories of her wars and my own boring childhood on a farm colony 3 systems from Earth, something had shifted. She stopped watching me like prey, and started watching me like a puzzle she wanted to solve. I stopped seeing chains, and started seeing a person underneath them, someone tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. By week 4, the guards had mostly stopped standing near the door when I visited. They still watched through the cameras, but they no longer flinched every time she moved. "Your crew fears me less now," she said one evening, watching me set down her food. "You haven't eaten anyone yet, that helps." I could still. "You won't." "How certain are you?" I sat down across from her, farther than arm's reach but closer than I used to sit. "Pretty certain. You had 6 chances in 4 weeks. You've had my throat within reach a dozen times. You're still here talking to me instead." She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind those amber eyes. "Perhaps I find you more useful alive." "Sure, let's go with that." We fell into something like a routine after that. Meals, conversation, silence that no longer felt tense. I learned that Cathari queens were bred for command from birth, trained to lead fleets before they were old enough, by human standards, to drive a car. I learned that Vera had lost 2 sisters in wars before she turned 20, in Cathari years, which translated to something close to human adulthood. I learned that she had never once been asked what she wanted, only what she was expected to become. "Do you enjoy this?" I asked her once, somewhere around week 5, the fighting, the command. She was quiet for a long time before answering. "I do not know what enjoyment feels like separate from duty. I have never been given the chance to find out." That answer stayed with me longer than I expected it to. By the 6th week, the ship was nearing the research station, and I think we both knew what that meant, though neither of us said it out loud for days. On our second to last night together, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "What happens to me at your station?" Questioning. Study. I don't know exactly. Command doesn't share everything with a supply captain. "Will I see you again?" I did not have an honest answer that would not hurt, so I gave her something else instead, something that started as a joke and ended up meaning more than I intended. "Tell you what, if this war ever ends, and you're still around, and you've somehow stopped being a war queen with an army at your back, I'll marry you." She stared at me, and for a moment, I thought I had finally, truly offended her. Then she laughed, that grinding, strange, wonderful sound, longer and louder than I had ever heard from her.
"Humans," she said, once the laughter faded. "Joke about the most serious things."
"Who says I'm joking?" Her eyes went sharp and focused, studying me like she was trying to find the lie in my face and could not locate one. "You are a strange creature, Daniel Ashwood. You're one to talk." The next morning, a transfer team arrived to take her to the research station. I was not permitted to accompany her past the docking bay. I watched them lead her away in new restraints, heavier than the old ones, and just before she passed through the airlock, she turned back and looked at me one last time. "I will remember your promise, small captain. I'll remember it too." That was the last time I saw her for 12 years. The war did not end quickly. It ground on, brutal and slow, eating up years and ships and people I knew. I made Commodore eventually, though the promotion felt hollow most days, earned through survival more than skill. I heard, through channels that were never quite official, that the Cathari Empire had begun collapsing from the inside, torn apart by disputes over succession, weakened by a war it could no longer sustain. I heard rumors that a war queen once held at a human research station had died in a prison uprising during the chaos. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself a lot of things during those years that were not entirely true. I built a life around the shape of her absence, without fully realizing that was what I was doing. I never married. I never really tried. Friends assumed it was the war, the years of service, the constant deployments that left no room for anything steady. I let them believe that because the real reason felt too strange to explain, even to myself. 12 years is a long time, long enough to almost convince yourself that a memory was smaller and less important than it actually was. I was stationed on Meridian Outpost when everything changed again. It started as a routine morning, reports to file, supply manifests to check, nothing unusual. Then the alert came through that a diplomatic shuttle was requesting docking clearance under an old treaty flag, one that had not been used since before the war ended 3 years earlier. The flag belonged to no government we currently recognized. Station command scrambled extra security. I was called down as a formality, a senior officer with old war experience who might recognize the markings on the shuttle. I did not expect to recognize the person who stepped out of it. The docking bay doors opened, and out walked a figure I had spent 12 years trying not to think about. 9 feet tall, dark-plated skin now marked with new scars alongside old ones. Eyes the same burning amber I remembered as clearly as if no time had passed at all. Every guard in the bay raised their weapons on instinct. I raised my hand instead, signaling them to stand down, though my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "You got old, small captain," Vera said, and her voice still carried that same low, layered sound I had never forgotten. "You're supposed to be dead," I said, because it was the only thing my brain could manage to produce. I allowed that story to spread. An empire that believes its queen is gone stops hunting for her. It gave me time to do what needed doing without a target on my back. What needed doing? Ending a war from inside a cell is slower than ending one from a command deck, but it can be done if you are patient enough and if you are willing to let people believe you no longer exist. She stepped past 2 very confused security officers as though they were simply part of the scenery. It took me 11 years to unravel my own empire from within a research station and a series of quiet prisons after it. It took 1 more year to find you again, once I was finally free to look. You could have sent a message. You could have waited without growing old. I laughed before I could stop myself. Right there in the middle of a crowded docking bay, in front of a dozen very startled officers, and 1 deeply unimpressed diplomatic escort. You remember what I said, before they took you. Her mandibles clicked together in that familiar pattern I had once mistaken for a threat, and had eventually learned meant something much gentler. I remember every word of it. I have had 12 years, and very little else to do but remember it. She raised 1 massive scarred hand toward me, claws carefully sheathed, palm turned upward, a gesture I recognized instantly from stories she had told me years earlier, on a transport ship that no longer existed. It was a gesture reserved, in her culture, for mates, and for monarchs. Nothing casual, nothing offered lightly. You made a promise to me on a prison transport, Daniel Ashwood. I did not spend 12 years dismantling an empire and outrunning assassins from my own bloodline, just to be told that humans do not keep their jokes. Every single person in that docking bay was staring at us. I did not care about a single one of them. "No," I said, reaching out and taking her hand, feeling the strange, familiar texture of her skin against mine for the first time in over a decade. "We really don't." What followed over the next several months was stranger than anything I had experienced during the war itself. Vera was not simply visiting. She had spent her years of quiet imprisonment learning everything she could about human systems, human diplomacy, human weaknesses in the empire that had once ruled her people, and she had used every piece of that knowledge to bring down a government from the inside without ever lifting a weapon in open combat. The Cathari Empire that remained after her long, patient campaign was smaller, fractured, but no longer capable of the kind of large-scale war that had once cost my side 11,000 lives in a single battle. She had ended a war using patience and information instead of ships and soldiers, and she had done it while everyone, including me, believed she was gone. She told me all of this slowly, over weeks, the same way she had once told me stories on the Halcyon, except now there was no fear in the room, no chains, no guards standing tense near the door. We sat together in quiet corners of Meridian Outpost while she explained how she had convinced a rival faction within her own empire to turn against the leadership that replaced her, how she had passed information through channels even her own people did not know existed, how she had waited, year after year, for the right moment to resurface. Why me? I asked her one evening, months into her stay, when the strangeness of the situation had softened into something closer to comfort. Out of everyone you could have gone looking for, why come back for a joke made on a prison transport? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Because you were the only person in 12 years of captivity, war, and quiet planning who ever spoke to me as though I were something other than a weapon or a threat. You brought me food without being ordered to. You asked me questions no one else asked. You made a promise that cost you nothing to make and everything to keep, and you kept believing it long enough that I could feel it, even from across a galaxy, even while everyone told me you had likely died in the war like so many others. I didn't die. No, you got old instead, and stubborn, and you never married anyone else, which either means you are hopeless with people, or you were waiting for something. Maybe both. She made that grinding laugh sound again, softer now, less strange to my ears than it had ever been before. Humans, she said, truly do joke about the most serious things. Some jokes turn out to be true. Meridian Outpost's Council eventually approved her official presence on human territory, a decision that took considerable negotiation and more paperwork than either of us cared to deal with, but which succeeded largely because of everything she had done to end a war that had cost both our species enormous losses. She was no longer seen as a threat by most who came to know her story, though there were always a few who never fully trusted a former war queen walking freely among us. She did not seem to mind their doubt. She had spent her whole life being doubted, feared, and misunderstood, and one skeptical officer here or there barely registered against everything else she had survived. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony that would have looked strange to anyone unfamiliar with either of our histories, a human commodore and a Cathari queen who was no longer a queen of anything but her own choices. Grace Whitfield, the same security officer who had once warned me against spending too much time with a prisoner, stood as a witness, having long since become one of Vera's closest friends on the station, something neither of us could have predicted 12 years earlier. Standing there afterward, watching the light shift over Meridian's horizon, Vera reached for my hand the same way she had in that crowded docking bay months before, palm turned upward, steady and certain. 12 years, she said quietly, for one small joke. Best joke I ever made. I intend to remind you of that every day for the rest of your very short human life. I wouldn't expect anything less. And for the first time since that cargo hold, all those years ago, with alarms screaming and weapons raised and fear thick enough to choke on, there was nothing left between us but quiet and warmth and the strange, patient promise that had somehow outlasted an entire war.